This 4-year-old beggar girl says to Millionaire, "I just wanted a piece of bread." Then he takes her to the most expensive bakery and something incredible happens. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The stifling July heat in Asheville, North Carolina, made the asphalt shimmer like water, and Walter Sterling adjusted the collar of his dress shirt, already soaked with sweat, as he hurried down Biltmore Avenue. At 52, the owner of a small chain of furniture stores was used to the end-of-year rush, when holiday sales demanded his constant presence at the 3 stores he had built with so much effort over 20 years. His determined footsteps echoed on the sidewalk when a weak little voice made him stop abruptly. "Please, mister, I just wanted a piece of bread." The girl who approached him couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with tangled brown hair, and clothes so dirty that it was impossible to distinguish their original color. Her big brown eyes shone with a mixture of hope and fear, as if expecting to be chased away at any moment. Walter felt something tighten in his chest. There was something in that child's voice that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, crouching down to her height. "Isabelle," she replied softly, shrinking as if expecting some kind of scolding. Without hesitation, Walter extended his hand to her. "Come with me, Isabelle. Let's get you something to eat." He took her to the Biltmore Crumb, the most expensive and refined bakery in the city, where artisanal breads cost what many families spent on food for an entire day. The employees looked strangely at the dirty girl accompanied by a well-dressed man, but Walter ignored the whispers. "Choose anything you want," he said, watching as Isabelle's eyes widened at the window full of sweets, breads, and savory pastries. She pointed timidly at a sandwich and a juice box, but Walter ordered much more: a variety of breads, a full deli sandwich, a slice of chocolate cake, natural orange juice, and even wrapped some breads for her to take with her. Seated at a table in the back of the bakery, Walter watched, fascinated, as Isabelle devoured the food with a desperate hunger that reminded him of something painful buried in his own childhood memories. Each bite was rushed, as if someone was going to take the food away from her at any moment. "Slow down, sweetheart," he said gently. "No one's going to take your food." "Where do you live, Isabelle?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The girl stopped eating for a moment, her eyes again showing that fear he had noticed before. "With Aunt Carol," she murmured, returning to eating without looking at him. "And your parents?" The question made Isabelle shrug almost imperceptibly, a gesture that said more than any word could express. Walter felt a pang in his heart. He and his wife, Beatrice, had tried to have children for almost 15 years, facing treatments, frustrated hopes, and the growing emptiness that this impossibility had created in their lives. Seeing that abandoned child awakened in him a protective instinct that he didn't know he possessed. "Isabelle, do you come here to ask for food every day?" he asked gently. She nodded affirmatively. "Aunt Carol makes me. She says I need to bring money or food otherwise." The sentence hung in the air, but the fear in her eyes completed what the words didn't say. When they finished eating, Walter accompanied Isabelle to a corner near downtown, where she said she needed to stay to work. He watched from afar as she approached other people, always with that same shyness and those eyes that begged for compassion. Many ignored her, others gave her a few coins, but no one stopped to really see her as he had done. That night at home, Walter couldn't get Isabelle out of his thoughts. Beatrice, his 48-year-old wife, noticed his distraction during dinner. "Did something happen at the store?" she asked, her blonde hair tied in an elegant bun and her blue eyes showing the genuine concern she had always had for her husband. "I met a girl today," Walter said, telling her about the encounter. Beatrice listened in silence, and he could see in her face the same pain he felt. Both carried invisible scars left by the impossibility of having their own children, a wound that had never healed completely. "You're going to look for her tomorrow, aren't you?" asked Beatrice, knowing her husband too well. Walter nodded, feeling grateful for her understanding. "We need to help her, Bea. That child needs someone." The next day, Walter altered his usual routine. Instead of going straight to the store, he went to Biltmore Avenue looking for Isabelle. He found her in the same spot, but this time she looked even thinner and her eyes were swollen, as if she had been crying. "Isabelle," he called, and her little face lit up with a shy smile that warmed his heart. "I brought something for you," he said, handing her a bag with children's clothes that Beatrice had bought the night before, along with a nutritious snack and a small doll. Isabelle's eyes filled with tears when she saw the doll, as if it were the first she had ever received in her life. "I can't stay," she said, looking nervously around. "Aunt Carol will be angry if I don't bring money today." Walter felt anger rise in his chest, but kept his voice calm. "How much do you need to bring?" When she whispered a low amount, he immediately took the money out of his wallet and gave it to her, along with a little more. "Isabelle, if you need anything at all, look for me at Sterling Furniture there on Main Street. Promise?" The girl nodded fervently, carefully putting away the money and clutching the doll against her chest. As he walked to work, Walter couldn't imagine that this second meeting was just the beginning of a journey that would completely transform his life. He didn't yet know that Isabelle would disappear for days on end, always returning in worse condition. He didn't know that his generosity would spark conflicts in his marriage that was already facing silent tensions. And much less could he imagine the devastating truths he would discover about the girl's life, and the impossible decisions he would be forced to make. What he did know, as he opened the door to his store that hot July morning, was that something fundamental had changed inside him. Isabelle had awakened a need to protect and love that he thought he had lost forever, and that discovery was only just beginning to reveal its consequences. The following days turned into a new routine for Walter. Every morning, before opening the stores, he would pass by Biltmore Avenue looking for Isabelle. He didn't always find her at the same time. Sometimes she would appear early, other times only in the late afternoon, and there were days when she simply wasn't there. These absences began to worry him in a way that he couldn't explain even to himself. When he found her, he always brought something: a snack, clean clothes, new shoes that invariably disappeared the next time he saw her. Isabelle received everything with that silent gratitude that broke his heart, but he noticed that she was always looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Isabelle, your Aunt Carol, is she good to you?" he asked one morning when he found her with a bruise on her arm. The girl shrunk immediately, pulling the sleeve of her blouse to cover the mark. "She only gets mad when I don't bring enough money," she murmured, avoiding his eyes. Walter felt his blood boil, but forced himself to stay calm. "And where do you live?" Isabelle pointed vaguely in the direction of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. "It's far from here, in a little room in the back of Mrs. Lawson's house." Her voice became even lower. "But Aunt Carol said that if I tell strangers where we live, bad things will happen." At home, Beatrice noticed the changes in her husband's behavior. He arrived later, left earlier, and always seemed distracted, lost in thoughts that she couldn't reach. During dinner one Thursday, she finally decided to address the issue. "Walter, have you been meeting with that girl every day?" she asked, carefully cutting a piece of meat on her plate. There was something in her voice that he couldn't completely identify. It wasn't exactly disapproval, but it wasn't approval either. "Not every day," he replied defensively. "Sometimes she doesn't show up. I get worried when that happens." Beatrice put her fork down and looked at him directly. "How much money have you been giving her?" Walter hesitated. In the past 2 weeks, he had spent over $1,000 between food, clothes, and direct money for Isabelle. For a man who had always been careful with the family finances, it was a significant amount. "Enough to help her," he said, avoiding being specific. "Don't you think that maybe we should contact the authorities, social services, child protective services?" suggested Beatrice, her voice filled with genuine concern. "A 6-year-old shouldn't be on the streets asking for money." "What if they take her to a shelter?" countered Walter, more harshly than he intended. "What if they separate her from this Aunt Carol, and she ends up in an even worse situation?" Beatrice was silent for a moment, observing her husband. She could see the passion and the care in his eyes, but she also perceived something deeper, an almost desperate need to protect that child. "I just think we need to be careful," she said finally. "We don't know the whole situation, and—" she hesitated before completing, "maybe you're getting too emotionally involved." Beatrice's words echoed in Walter's mind throughout the night. He knew that she was partly right, but something inside him refused to abandon Isabelle. The next morning, when he didn't find her in the usual spot, the anxiety he felt confirmed his wife's suspicions about his emotional involvement. He went 3 days without seeing her, 3 days in which he could barely concentrate on work, constantly checking his cell phone as if she might call, walking the streets of downtown during lunch breaks in the hope of finding her. His employees began to notice his distraction, and the week's sales fell below expectations for the Christmas season. On the 4th day, when he finally saw her again, Walter was shocked. Isabelle was visibly thinner, her skin pale, and her eyes sunken. The doll he had given her had disappeared, and her clothes, different from the ones he had bought, were even dirtier and more torn than before. "Isabelle, where have you been?" he asked, crouching before her with a mixture of relief and concern. "I was sick," she said simply, but there was something in her voice that sounded rehearsed, as if it were an answer she had been instructed to give. "Who took care of you when you were sick?" The girl hesitated, looking around nervously. "Aunt Carol. She said I was faking it and that I had to go back to the street when I got better." Walter felt his hands tremble with contained anger. "Isabelle, I need to meet your Aunt Carol," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Maybe I can help you both." The panic that took over the girl's face was immediate and terrifying. "No. She said that if I took anyone there, she would send me away, and I wouldn't have anywhere to stay." Walter realized that he was dealing with a much more complex and dangerous situation than he had imagined. "Okay, sweetheart. I won't meet her if you don't want me to," he said, seeing the immediate relief in Isabelle's eyes. "But I want you to know that you can always count on me, okay? Always." That afternoon, instead of going straight home, Walter decided to follow Isabelle from afar. He watched as she collected a few coins from other passers-by, always maintaining that humble and frightened demeanor. When the sun began to set, she began to walk towards the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Keeping a safe distance, Walter followed her through increasingly narrow streets and increasingly simple houses until they reached an area that he rarely visited. Isabelle stopped in front of a small and dilapidated house where a woman of approximately 35 years was sitting on the porch, a bottle of beer in her hand, even though it was only 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Carol, for it could only be her, had disheveled dark hair, dirty clothes, and a permanently irritated expression on her face. Walter saw when Isabelle approached her hesitantly, extending the coins she had collected. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could clearly see when Carol counted the money and made an expression of dissatisfaction, gesturing aggressively at the girl. What he saw next made his blood run cold. Carol grabbed Isabelle by the arm. with unnecessary force, shaking her while yelling something that he couldn't understand from a distance. The girl shrunk, clearly accustomed to this type of treatment, but Walter could see tears running down her face. When Carol finally let go of Isabelle and pushed her into the house, Walter had to restrain himself from running over there and confronting the woman immediately. His fists were clenched and his breathing was shallow. Never in his life had he felt such intense anger as he was feeling at that moment. As he walked back home, a crystal-clear certainty formed in his mind. He couldn't leave Isabelle in that situation. No matter what Beatrice thought, no matter how much it cost, he would find a way to take that child out of Carol's hands. What he didn't yet know was that his good intentions were about to unleash a series of events that would put them all in much greater danger than he could have imagined. The decision to confront Carol directly consumed Walter's thoughts throughout the night. He mentally rehearsed different approaches, imagining how he could convince her to treat Isabelle better, or even how he could offer financial help in exchange for better conditions for the girl. However, when he arrived at the dilapidated house, the next morning, armed with determination and a considerable amount of money, he discovered that the reality was much darker than he had imagined. Carol was again on the porch, this time with a bottle of whiskey, even though it was only 9 o'clock in the morning. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she was swaying slightly in the broken plastic chair. When she saw Walter approaching, her expression changed from sleepy to suspicious. "Who are you and what do you want here?" she asked, her voice slurred with alcohol. Walter took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm Walter Sterling. I've been helping Isabelle on the streets, and I'd like to talk to you about her." Carol's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Oh, so you're the one filling her head with nonsense." "Isabelle," she shouted towards the house, "come here now!" The girl appeared in the doorway, and Walter's heart constricted when he saw that she was barefoot, with the same dirty clothes as the day before, and a terrified look on her face. "I didn't do anything wrong, Aunt Carol," she said quickly, her words laden with fear. "I'm not mad at you, girl," said Carol, but her voice didn't sound reassuring at all. "It's with this man here that I want to talk." She stood up unsteadily and pointed at Walter. "Do you think you can just show up here and tell me how to take care of my niece?" "Actually, I came to offer help," Walter said carefully. "I realized that you're going through difficulties, and I thought that maybe I could—" Carol interrupted him with a bitter laugh. "Help? Everyone wants to help, don't they? But where were you when I needed to take care of this child without having anything? How much would you need to stop sending Isabelle to the streets?" Walter asked directly, deciding to get straight to the point. Carol stopped laughing and looked at him with renewed interest. "500 a week," she said without hesitation, as if she had already thought about that amount before. It was a high amount, but Walter didn't hesitate. "I accept, but I want to see where Isabelle sleeps and make sure she's being well taken care of." Carol's expression changed again, this time to something between anger and panic. "That's none of your business. She's alive, isn't she? That's already more than many kids have." It was then that Mrs. Lawson, the owner of the house, appeared at the door. She was a woman of about 60 years old, thin and with tired eyes. "Carol, who is this man?" she asked, looking suspiciously at Walter. "He's no one important," Carol replied quickly. "Just someone who wants to meddle where he's not wanted." But Mrs. Lawson continued looking at Walter, and he noticed something in her expression, a mixture of shame and worry. "Are you related to Isabelle?" Walter asked Mrs. Lawson. The woman exchanged a quick glance with Carol before answering. "No, I just rent a small room in the back to them." "Can I see where the girl lives?" Walter insisted. Carol immediately placed herself between him and the door. "You can't know. This is my house, and you have no right to enter here." Her voice was getting louder and more aggressive. It was when Mrs. Lawson, to everyone's surprise, said softly, "Let him see, Carol. Maybe it's better this way." Carol looked at her furiously, but she was too drunk to argue effectively. What Walter saw in the back of the house made him nauseous. The small room was actually a tiny windowless storage room with an old and dirty mattress on the floor, without sheets or pillows. The ceiling had leaks, there was mold on the walls, and an unbearable smell of dampness and dirt. There was no private bathroom, no closet for clothes, not even a table or chair. "My God," he murmured, looking at Isabelle, who was huddled in a corner, clearly ashamed. "You sleep here, sweetheart." She nodded without speaking, her eyes full of tears. "It's what we can afford," Carol shouted defensively. "At least she has a roof." But Walter had noticed something that left him even more disturbed. There were no personal belongings of Isabelle in the room. No clothes, no toys, nothing. That indicated that a child actually lived there. "Where are the clothes I bought for her?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. Carol hesitated before answering. She dirtied everything. I had to throw them away." It was then that Mrs. Lawson, who had been silent until that moment, finally spoke. "Carol, I can't take this situation anymore. This man seems to really want to help the girl." She turned to Walter. "I need to tell you the truth, sir." "Shut up, Lawson!" Carol shouted, but the woman continued. "Isabelle is not her niece. Carol found this child abandoned at the bus station 2 years ago and decided to keep her, but not to take care of her, to use her." Walter's world seemed to collapse. "How do you mean, use her?" he asked, although he already suspected the answer. "To ask for money on the streets," continued Mrs. Lawson, ignoring Carol's increasingly loud protests. "And when she doesn't bring enough money, Carol hits her and leaves her without food." Walter looked at Isabelle, who was trembling in the corner of the filthy little room. "Is it true, sweetheart? Carol is not your aunt?" The girl looked at him with huge eyes full of tears and nodded slowly. "She said that if I told anyone, she would leave me on the street again, and that no one would want to help me because I'm an orphan." The anger that Walter felt at that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His hands were shaking as he approached Carol. "You're exploiting a child," he said, his voice low but filled with contained fury. "That's a crime." "And what are you going to do?" Carol retorted, her liquid courage still present. "Call the police? They'll take her to a shelter full of people worse than me. At least with me, she has somewhere to sleep." "She's coming with me now," Walter said, extending his hand to Isabelle. "She's not, no." Carol shouted, trying to place herself between them. "She's my responsibility. I've taken care of her for 2 years. Mrs. Lawson sighed heavily. "Carol, let the girl go. You know this isn't right. You only use her to get money for drinks." The accusation was like a slap in Carol's face, who was momentarily speechless. Walter picked Isabelle up in his arms, feeling how light she was for a 6-year-old child. "Don't worry, sweetheart. You're not going back to that place again." But as he walked towards the car, carrying the girl who had finally stopped trembling, he had no idea that Carol was already planning her revenge. That same night, while Isabelle slept safely in Walter and Beatrice's house, Carol made a call that would change everything. "Hello, police. I want to report a kidnapping." The real battle for Isabelle's life was just beginning. The ringing of the doorbell at 6 o'clock in the morning awakened Walter from a restless sleep. Still wearing his robe, he went downstairs while Beatrice followed him, worried. Isabelle had spent her first night in safety in the guest room, finally sleeping deeply after a hot bath and a full meal. "Walter Sterling?" asked the officer who was at the door, accompanied by a social worker. "I'm Sergeant Reynolds. We received A report of a child abduction, and we need to verify the situation of a child who is supposedly in this residence." Walter's blood ran cold. Abduction? There was no abduction. I brought a girl who was being exploited. "Sir, we need to see the child and understand the situation," interrupted the social worker, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression. "It's standard procedure in cases like this." Beatrice squeezed her husband's arm, her eyes showing the panic she was feeling. They went together to the room where Isabelle was sleeping, and Walter felt his heart ache as he saw how small and fragile she looked in the big bed, hugging the teddy bear that Beatrice had given her the night before. "Isabelle, sweetheart," he called softly. The girl woke up immediately, and upon seeing the strangers in the room, her face twisted in fear. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No, my love, you didn't do anything wrong," said Beatrice, sitting on the bed beside her. "These people just want to talk to us." But Isabelle was clearly terrified, shrinking under the covers. The social worker approached carefully. "Hi, Isabelle. My name is Sarah. Can I ask you a few questions?" The girl looked at Walter, seeking approval, and he nodded encouragingly. "Aunt Carol said that you took me away against her will," said Sarah gently. "Is that true?" Isabelle began to cry silently. "I didn't want to go back there. Mr. Sterling was good to me. Aunt Carol, she hit me when I didn't bring enough money." The sergeant exchanged a meaningful look with the social worker. "Mr. Sterling, we understand your intention to help, but the law is clear about this type of situation. The child needs to be placed in state custody until the situation is clarified." "No!" cried Isabelle, jumping out of bed and running into Beatrice's arms. "Please, don't take me back. I promise I'll be good." Her desperate tears broke the hearts of everyone present. Walter felt his life crumble. "You can't take her to a shelter. You saw the conditions in which she was living. That woman was exploiting her." "Sir, we understand your concern," said Sarah gently, "but there are legal procedures that must be followed. We're going to investigate everything, but for now, Isabelle needs to stay in an appropriate institution." "What if I hire a lawyer?" asked Walter desperately. "What if we start a legal guardianship process?" Sarah sighed. "It's possible, but it's going to take time, and in the meantime, the girl must remain under state supervision." What followed was the most painful scene that Walter had ever witnessed. Isabelle clung to Beatrice with a desperate force, begging not to be taken away. "You promised me that I could stay," she sobbed. "You lied like everyone else." Beatrice was crying as much as the girl. "It's not forever, my love. We're going to fight for you to come back. I promise." But her words sounded empty even to herself, because none of them knew if they could really keep that promise. When they finally took Isabelle away, the house was filled with a sepulchral silence. Beatrice locked herself in the bedroom, crying uncontrollably, while Walter stood in the living room, looking at the teddy bear that had been left behind in the haste and confusion. "This is my fault," he murmured to himself. "I should have sought legal help from the beginning." Guilt consumed him, but it was too late for regrets. Now he needed to act. In the following weeks, Walter dedicated himself obsessively to finding legal solutions. He hired Michelle Davis, a lawyer specializing in child and adolescent law, spending a fortune on fees that he could barely afford. "The case is complicated," she explained during the first consultation. "You technically removed a child from the custody of her legal guardian, even if the intentions were good." "But she wasn't really Isabelle's aunt," protested Walter. "Does that make a difference?" "It does, but we need to prove it. And we also need to demonstrate that you can offer a suitable and stable home for the girl," replied Michelle. "The process could take months, maybe a year." Meanwhile, Walter tried to visit Isabelle at the shelter, but the rules were strict. Only supervised visits were allowed once a week, and he could see how the girl was regressing with each encounter. She had lost weight again. She was quieter and more withdrawn, and her eyes had lost that spark of hope that he had seen grow during the days in his house. "When can I go home?" she asked at each visit, and Walter felt his heart break because he didn't have an answer. "Soon, sweetheart. We're working on it," he said, but he could see that she was beginning to stop believing him. The situation at home with Beatrice was also deteriorating. The stress of the legal process and the pain of having lost Isabelle were taking their toll. "On the marriage, maybe we should have left things as they were," said Beatrice one night, her voice filled with bitterness. "At least she was free, even if in bad conditions." "You can't be serious," countered Walter. "You saw that place where she lived. You saw how that woman treated her." "And now she's trapped in a shelter, feeling abandoned by us," said Beatrice, tears streaming down her face. "How is that better?" The discussion escalated into the worst fight they had ever had in 20 years of marriage. Accusations were made, old pains were exposed, and when the dust settled, Beatrice had decided that she needed some time to think. "I'm going to stay a few days at my sister's house in Charlotte," she announced, packing her bags. "I need space to process all this." Alone in the house that seemed to echo with memories of Isabelle, Walter dedicated himself even more intensely to work, trying to earn enough money to pay the rising legal costs. But his concentration was compromised, and, for the first time in his career, his stores began to show losses. It was during one of the visits to the shelter that Walter received the news that would change everything again. "Mr. Sterling," said the director of the institution, "I need to inform you about a delicate situation. A woman has appeared claiming to be Isabelle's grandmother. She has documents that seem legitimate." The world seemed to stop around Walter. After everything they had been through, after all the suffering and struggle, now there was another person claiming custody of Isabelle. "What kind of documents?" he asked, his voice barely coming out of his throat. "Isabelle's mother's birth certificate, the same's death certificate, and documents proving kinship," replied the director. "The lady's name is Dolores Johnson, and she says she has been looking for her granddaughter for 2 years. That night, Walter called Michelle in. Panic. "What does this mean for our case?" he asked. The lawyer's response was devastating. "It means that we will have to fight not only against the state, but against a legitimate biological relative, and in most cases, blood has priority." As Walter absorbed this new reality, a terrifying question hammered in his mind. After all they had suffered, was it possible that they were about to lose Isabelle forever? The first meeting with Dolores Johnson took place in a cold and impersonal room at the shelter, under the supervision of social worker Sarah and the director of the institution. Walter arrived with Michelle, both tense and prepared for a legal battle that could define Isabelle's future. What he didn't expect was to come across a 71-year-old lady, small and frail, with grey hair tied in a simple bun, and eyes that carried the same sweet sparkle that he had learned to love in Isabelle. Dolores wore a simple, patched-up dress, shoes worn by time, and carried a faded plastic bag where she carefully kept her documents. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from advanced age. And when she smiled shyly at Walter, he felt his heart clench in an unexpected way. "You must be Walter," she said with a soft but firm voice. "I've heard you've been taking care of my little granddaughter." There was no accusation in her voice, just a sincere gratitude that caught Walter off guard. "I want to thank you for everything you've done for her." When they brought Isabelle into the room, the girl's reaction was instantaneous and emotional. Her eyes widened, and even after 2 years of separation, some deep and primal memory made her run towards the lady. "Grandma Dolores," she whispered, as if testing if her memories were real. "My little star," said Dolores, opening her arms to receive her granddaughter. "How you've grown." The hug between them was long and filled with emotion, and Walter watched with a mixture of joy and pain in his heart. It was evident that there was a real bond between them, a connection that he could never replicate, no matter how much he loved Isabelle. "I thought you had forgotten about me," said Isabelle, clinging to her grandmother, as if fearing that she would disappear again. "Never, my angel," replied Dolores, kissing the girl's forehead. "I've looked for you every day since your mother left." The story that Dolores told in the following hours was heartbreaking. Her daughter, Roberta, had become involved with a violent man when Isabelle was only 4 years old. "He didn't like her bringing the girl to visit me," explained Dolores, her tears falling silently. "One day, Roberta showed up here all bruised, grabbed some of Isabelle's clothes, and said they were going on a trip. It was the last time I saw them." Dolores had gone through police stations, shelters, and institutions in various cities, always carrying old photographs of Isabelle and her daughter. "I knew something bad had happened when I stopped receiving news," she continued. "It was only last month that I found out that my Roberta had passed away and that Isabelle was missing." The lawyer Michelle watched everything with professional attention, but even she seemed touched by the old woman's sincerity. "Mrs. Johnson," she said respectfully, "do you understand that Mr. Sterling has also developed a very strong bond with Isabelle? He has invested a lot of time and resources trying to protect her." "I understand," replied Dolores, looking directly at Walter, "and I'm grateful for that. But she is my family, Mr. Sterling. She's all I have left in the world." Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm already an old lady. I know I may not be able to offer her everything that you can, but she's my little granddaughter." Walter felt as if he was being torn in half. During the months of legal struggle, he had convinced himself that he was doing what was best for Isabelle. Now, looking at the girl's real grandmother, he questioned whether he wasn't being selfish, trying to keep a child away from her legitimate family. "Where do you live?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "In Hendersonville," replied Dolores. "I have a small house that my late husband left me. It's not much, but it's clean, and there's plenty of love to give." "And how do you support yourself?" Michelle needed to ask these questions, even if they were painful. Dolores hesitated before answering. "I receive a small social security check. I've always lived simply. I've never needed much. But I know I can't give Isabelle the opportunities that a prosperous man like Mr. Sterling can offer." Dolores's brutal honesty left everyone silent. Isabelle, who had been quiet in her grandmother's lap, finally spoke. "Grandma, where were you when I was with Aunt Carol? Why didn't you find me before?" The child's innocent question was like a stab in Dolores's heart. "I looked, my angel, I looked so much, but I didn't know where you were. Your mother never told me where they had gone." Her tears were now falling freely. "If I had known you were suffering, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." Walter observed the interaction between grandmother and granddaughter, and a painful realization began to form in his mind. Isabelle was not just an abandoned child he had saved. She had a family, a history, roots that he could never replace. But at the same time, he saw the real dilemma. Dolores clearly loved the girl, but she was in a precarious financial situation and was of advanced age. "Mrs. Johnson," he said finally, "can I ask you a question? What are your plans for Isabelle's future, education, medical care?" Dolores sighed deeply. "I know I can't offer what you can. The public school in my town isn't the best, and if she gets sick, I don't know if I would have the resources. But she has plenty of love to give," said Isabelle softly, hugging her grandmother tighter. "And I remember the smell of your cookies and how you sang to me to sleep." At that moment, Michelle had an idea that would change the course of the whole situation. "What if we found a solution that would benefit everyone?" she said. "Something that would ensure that Isabelle maintained the bond with her grandmother, but also had access to the opportunities that Mr. Sterling can provide." Everyone looked at her with curiosity. "I'm thinking of something like a shared custody agreement," continued Michelle, "and not officially, because legally only one person can have custody, but an agreement where Isabelle would divide her time between you two." Dolores and Walter looked at each other, both processing the possibility. "How would that work?" asked Dolores. "Isabelle could live with Mr. Sterling during the school year, have access to quality education and medical care, but spend the vacations and holidays with you," explained Michelle. "This way, she would maintain the family bond, but also have opportunities for growth." "And me?" asked Isabelle, looking from one to the other. "Can I choose?" The girl's question brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. That 6-year-old child had already gone through so much suffering that she was now asking to have a choice about her own future. Walter knelt down to Isabelle's height. "Sweetheart, what would you like to happen?" Isabelle looked at him then, at Dolores, her little shoulders carrying a weight that no child should bear. "I want to stay with both of you," she said finally. "I want Grandma Dolores to teach me how to make cookies like Mom used to make, and I want Mr. Walter to help me learn to read better." The simplicity and wisdom of her answer left everyone emotional. But Walter knew that there were still enormous obstacles ahead. Beatrice had not returned home. His stores were in financial trouble due to his absence, and now he would need to find a way to make work a complex arrangement that would depend on the goodwill of everyone involved. When they left the shelter that afternoon, a question echoed in Walter's mind. Would it be possible to build a non-traditional family where everyone sacrificed something for Isabelle's sake? And more importantly, would Beatrice agree to share the girl she had learned to love with a grandmother who had legal rights superior to theirs? The call that Walter made to Beatrice that night was one of the most difficult of his life. Sitting in the empty living room of his house, with the cell phone trembling in his hands, he knew that he was about to ask his wife something that might seem impossible to accept. "I need you to come home," he said as soon as she answered. "Something important happened with Isabelle." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Beatrice responded, her voice filled with emotional fatigue. "Walter, I'm still not ready to—" "She has a grandmother," he interrupted softly, "a real grandmother who loves her and has looked for her for 2 years. He then told her about Dolores, about the emotional meeting at the shelter, about Michelle's proposal for shared custody. I need your help to decide what's best for Isabelle." Beatrice arrived the next day, and Walter could see that the weeks of separation had taken their toll. She was thinner, with dark circles under her eyes, but her eyes still carried that determination that he had learned to love over the years. The second meeting at the shelter, this time with Beatrice present, was even more revealing. Dolores and Beatrice observed each other carefully at first, two women who loved the same child, but came from completely different worlds. Dolores, with her genuine simplicity and unconditional love, and Beatrice, with her natural elegance and deep desire for motherhood. "You're very pretty," said Dolores to Beatrice, breaking the initial ice. "Isabelle told me that you gave her a bath and gave her a teddy bear." Beatrice blushed slightly. "She deserved to be taken care of properly," she replied. "Any child deserves it." It was Isabelle who once again brought clarity to the confusing situation. "Aunt B," she said, using the affectionate nickname she had created for Beatrice, "Grandma Dolores knows how to make cornbread cake like my mom used to make, and Mr. Walter promised to teach me how to ride a bike. Can't I have both?" The girl's innocent question touched something deep in Beatrice's heart. She looked at Dolores and saw not a rival, but an elderly woman who had lost her daughter and was now struggling to recover her granddaughter. "Mrs. Johnson," she said finally, "if we're going to make this work, we're going to need to work together. Isabelle has already suffered too much from adults who couldn't understand each other." During the following weeks, the four began a delicate process of building trust. Dolores came to Asheville and stayed in Walter and Beatrice's house, sleeping in the guest room, while everyone got to know each other better. Initially, there were tense moments, differences of opinion about education, food, routines. Dolores thought Beatrice was too protective, while Beatrice worried about Dolores's older methods. Walter tried to mediate, but sometimes felt lost between two strong women who wanted the best for Isabelle, but had different visions of what that meant. The real change happened one afternoon when Isabelle became ill with a high fever. Beatrice panicked, wanting to take her to the hospital immediately, while Dolores suggested traditional home remedies. The discussion could have turned into a fight, but Isabelle, even feverish, said, "Why don't you do both? Grandma Dolores can make her tea, and Aunt Bee can take me to the doctor." At that moment, both Beatrice and Dolores realized that they were putting their own fears and needs above Isabelle's well-being. From then on, they began to truly work as a team. The practical challenges, however, were enormous. This legal process was consuming all of Walter's savings, and his stores were facing serious difficulties due to his prolonged absence. Beatrice returned to work as an accountant, something she hadn't done in years, to help with expenses. Dolores, in turn, offered to sell her little house in Hendersonville to help with legal costs, a proposal that touched the couple deeply. "We're not going to let you do that," said Walter firmly. "We'll find another way." It was then that Michelle brought an unexpected proposal. "I have a client who is interested in buying 2 of your stores, Walter. The value would be enough to pay off the legal costs and still have some left over for an educational fund for Isabelle." The decision was painful. Those stores represented 20 years of Walter's hard work, his dreams and achievements. But looking at Isabelle playing in the backyard with Dolores, teaching her grandmother the new words she had learned to read, he knew he was making the right choice. "One store is enough," he said to Michelle. "Family is more important than business." The legal process lasted another 6 months, but this time everyone worked together. Dolores provided the necessary documentation to prove kinship, while Walter and Beatrice demonstrated their ability to offer a stable home. The judge's final proposal was surprisingly close to what Michelle had suggested: legal guardianship for Dolores, but with Isabelle living with Walter and Beatrice during the school year and spending vacations and holidays with her grandmother. Isabelle's first day at the private school that Walter managed to pay for was emotional for everyone. She was nervous, clinging to Beatrice's hand, but also excited about the possibility of learning new things. "When I learn to write properly, I'm going to send letters to Grandma Dolores every day," she said. Dolores had decided to move to a small apartment in Asheville, closer to the family, using the money from the sale of her house in Hendersonville. "I don't want to be away from my little granddaughter ever again," she said, "and you have become my family too." The new routine took time to settle in, but gradually found its rhythm. Dolores picked Isabelle up from school twice a week, taking her for walks in the park and teaching her the traditional family recipes. Beatrice took care of the medical and educational needs, while Walter dedicated himself to making his only remaining store work with renewed vigor. Weekends became special, with everyone together. Dolores taught Isabelle to sew and tell family stories. Beatrice helped her with homework and school projects, and Walter finally fulfilled his promise to teach her to ride a bike. A year later, on a warm July afternoon, exactly on the anniversary of the first meeting between Walter and Isabelle, everyone was gathered in the backyard of the house. Isabelle, now 7 years old, had grown considerably. Her hair shone with health, her eyes had regained that natural childhood liveliness, and she ran through the yard on a small bicycle, laughing loudly. "Look how happy she is," said Dolores, watching her granddaughter with tears of joy in her eyes. "I never imagined I could see her like this again." Beatrice, sitting next to her on an improvised bench, nodded. "It was difficult getting here, but it was worth every tear." Walter, who was adjusting the chain of Isabelle's bicycle, stopped to observe the scene. His only store was thriving again. He had regained focus on his work, and more importantly, he had learned that family is not defined only by blood, but by the choices we make and the love we share. "Uncle Walter," called Isabelle, stopping the bicycle in front of him. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when everything got difficult." The maturity in her words surprised everyone. That child had gone through so much suffering that she had developed a wisdom beyond her years. "I would never give up on you, sweetheart," he replied, hugging her. "You taught us that true love sometimes means sharing, not possessing." That night, after Isabelle went to sleep, the three adults sat in the living room to talk. "You know I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you've done," said Dolores. "You gave me back my little granddaughter and even gained a family." "We're the ones who are grateful," replied Beatrice. "Isabelle brought us a purpose that we didn't know we needed. And you taught us that love can multiply instead of divide." As they talked about plans for the future, the piano lessons that Isabelle wanted to start, the trip to visit Dolores's hometown, the girl's dreams of becoming a teacher, everyone knew they had created something special. It wasn't the traditional family that any of them had imagined, but it was perfect in its imperfection. Isabelle had found not only a home, but three people willing to sacrifice their own desires for her well-being. Walter and Beatrice had discovered that paternal love can arise from the most unexpected places, and Dolores had learned that sharing her granddaughter did not diminish her love, but multiplied it. Sometimes the strongest families are those we choose to build stone by stone, sacrifice by sacrifice, until love becomes the only foundation that matters.